All right, well, welcome here, everyone. It's great to see you join us for a topic that certainly I have a great deal of interest in and I think is increasingly consequential in the education landscape, which is this general idea of openness. And one of the aspects of openness that I think is certainly provocative in what Martin's going to be talking about is that on the one hand, we've made enormous progress with openness, but on the flip side, it almost feels like it's a bit of a hollow victory on some levels, especially as there's growing transitions to more immersive and analytic-related content that's being provided by publishers, which in some cases faculty or academics can use because it's easier to use and it doesn't necessarily follow the ideals of openness. So I'm quite excited from that end. On a personal note, Martin Weller was actually my supervisor when I was doing my PhD, so I have largely forgiven him, but it's great to have him come here and spend some time with us talking about a subject that I think is very consequential. Martin's written about this topic for a period of time. He's wrote a text would be about 3 years ago now where he looked at some of the aspects of being a digital scholar, which certainly is a topic that's very relevant to everybody in the room here, which is how do you increase the impact of your work through more immersive or informal distributed technologies rather than primarily through academics, articles and so on. Beyond that, he's heavily involved with the Open Education Resource Movement, an activity that he's leading in research projects that he's leading out of the Open University in UK. So without anything further, I'll pass it over to Martin to take it away.
Thanks, George. Okay, so George said I've written this book. Let me know if you can't hear me, by the way. This is the new cover, signed off last week, so it's too late to say you don't like it. Just say you like it. So I've written this book. Right, so I've been kind of writing about this stuff for a while now through my blog, and I kind of got to the stage where I think there's probably enough there to get together for a book. And so I've worked on this last year mainly, and it's being published by a company called Ubiquity, and it'll be open access. I'm a big open access zealot. So it should be out in time for Christmas for all the good bookstores. But of course it'll be a free EPUB and PDF under Creative Commons. So sometimes when I give this talk, I give a section of the book and just kind of explore that. Sometimes you get the whole thing. You're going to get the whole thing, a whole book in less than an hour. So the kind of central aim of the argument is that in many ways openness has been victorious. It's kind of an open approach to education. And we've kind of seen in lots of areas it become a really accepted way of operating. Now when I say it's been victorious, it doesn't mean it's kind of got 100% uptake, or if you were to stop any academic in the street and say, what's a MOOC? They'd know what you're talking about. But it does mean it's kind of, I think it's reached a certain stage over the past few years where it's reached a tipping point and it's becoming part of mainstream practice. And so increasingly across different areas, the open approach is seen as a good way to work. So it should be a sign, for those of us who've been working in open education for a long time, it should be a moment of victory. Great, we've kind of broken through all the things we thought we wanted. But at the same time, as George was saying, it doesn't feel quite like that. And I think it's like a lot of these things. But after that kind of initial victory, you often see this in kind of great revolutions through history. There's countries. You look at the French Revolution. It was a big revolution there. We've overthrown the monarchy, and then the next 10 years were kind of pretty awful. And so often it's that kind of after that initial victory that the real direction of that movement is decided. And I think that's the moment, that's the phase we're in at the moment. So there's lots of things to kind of be decided. So the structure of this talk. Firstly, I'm going to say why I've chosen that term, a battle, because I think some people don't really like use of military-type language, but I think just the use that term itself highlights some interesting things about the area. I'm going to briefly talk about the roots of what you might call modern open education. I'm going to look at 3 areas of open education. They're going to be open educational resources, MOOCs, and open access publishing. And for each of them, I'll look at how openness has won, how it's been successful, but down what the kind of battle areas are now, to kind of explore that tension in the book. And lastly, I want to talk about this idea about there being a battle for narrative, about the story we tell around open education, and then some conclusions. So, why call it a battle? I'm a big ice hockey fan. Part of the reason coming out to see, I pretended I want to come and see George, but actually I'm here with my daughter and we're going to go see Dallas Stars tomorrow, so just wrapping it all up, pretending to come and see George. So, but why is it a battle? There are 3 reasons, I think. First of all, there are kind of real areas of conflict. If you engage in this area, people have very different ideas about what's the best way to go forward, what are the best licenses to use, what's the best approach to open education. Are MOOCs a good approach? Are they operating correctly? All this kind of thing. So there are kind of real areas of conflict where people believe very different things. Secondly, there's real value. That's why people really have battles, is because there's money involved usually. The US Secretary of Education, I think, said that the global education market is worth something like $6 trillion. So it's a big market, and I think it's often seen as the next kind of ripe market for real kind of commercial intervention. They've done health, they've done all these other things, they've done public care, education's the next big one. Elsevier, I think, had a $2 billion turnover in terms of scientific and medical publications, which is all money, that's all articles that we as academics buy and produce. So, there's money there that people think worth going after. And the last one I think that's kind of quite interesting is that phrase, the victor writes history. So the people who are victorious in this battle for open get to decide what the narrative is. And the MOOCs, which I'll come to later, the kind of MOOC story is very interesting, it's a very good example of that. But I think we'll see similar things around lots of kind of educational technology developments. Learning analytics will probably be the next kind of big one. So I'm going to do that slightly academic thing now and avoid giving a definition of what I mean by open education. But instead I'm going to say there are kind of three areas that kind of coalesced to produce what we think of as modern open education. First of these was Open University, so I work at the Open University in the UK, founded in 1969. So that definition of open education is really looking at removing barriers to access, allowing people to come and study who couldn't study before. So we made our study part-time, you could study at home at a distance, there was no entry requirements, so you could bring in lots of people who were formerly excluded from education. There wasn't really an emphasis on free, often the government paid for that. So you get different types of emphasis for each of these elements. The next thing that's kind of really feeds into the modern open education movement is the idea of free software or open software. They're quite different offerings. So free software, the emphasis there is on rights. So the idea is that you can take software and you can take the code from that software and adapt it and share it again. From that, that led to a lot of movements like Creative Commons. So from that, we get the idea of you have control over the content. Open source was really much more about an emphasis on efficiency. So the slogan is like, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So for them, having open source software that anyone could then contribute to and adapt and share back to the community, that was just the best way to write software. And we see some of that with open educational resources. Perhaps the best way to produce learning content is to make it open and allow other people to adapt. And lastly, it's kind of a bit of a historic term, slightly naff term now, but Web 2.0. But from that whole Web 2.0 explosion, we kind of got an idea of people sharing stuff openly, putting stuff up, and easy to use, easy to share, and distribute and stuff. And suddenly, the idea of you sharing something as an individual became accepted. So really, you can think of open education as a set of these kind of coalescing principles. And part of the problem with that is that there's not one clear definition. And so that allows people to kind of take the definition and claim open education, because you can't say exactly that they're not right. So for different people, different sets of those things will be more important. So for the MOOC movement, free and easy access is really important. The open education resource movement, that the ability to reuse content and have an open license is really important. So that these kind of overlapping sets of principles, they're not necessarily the same for everybody in the field. So I'm going to look at three areas. So in the book I cover a fourth area, which is open scholarship. Jules Sellin wrote a book also called The Digital Scholar. So but I'm not going to cover that one here just in the interest of time. Also it's slightly different from the others, it's kind of much more nebulous practice. And it's also, you could also argue that the other three are subsumed into open scholarship. So the first one I'm going to look at is open access publishing. So open access publishing is commonly defined as free online access to scholarly works. And open access has kind of really been a success story. It's probably the most mature area in open education. So we've had really big breakthroughs in this, and lots of countries have issued mandates that any research which is publicly funded has to be made, the results of that have to be made open access. So in the UK we have the Finch report, and you've got different mandates in the States. So there's commonly argued to be two routes to open access. The gold route, which usually is funded, means that someone will pay a publisher what they call APCs, article processing charges, to make an article open access. And the green route is self-archiving. So you publish an article, it might be in a journal which is proprietary, but you can put it on your own institutional repository, your own website, and sometimes there's an embargo, so you can't do that until after 6 months, after 12 months. There are different routes of how we can achieve open access. There are major policies in most countries now which mandate all this publicly funded research to be made open access available. And that's kind of been a real mainstream, a real push through now. So it's kind of, if you talk to anyone who's publishing research, they'll have heard of open access now. So that's a really good example of how the battle's been won in many ways. That now people are kind of forced to publish open access. Journals are publishers are forced to adopt it. There was a survey from the publisher Wiley last year that found, I think, 51% of their authors had published open access articles. So again, that's kind of a really example of this, the victory of open access, if you like. You know, it's not 100%, but for the first time ever, it's kind of tipped over more than 50%. Now, this article plots the growth of open access articles and the growth of open access journals. You'll see there's a trend there. There's no reason to think that's not going to continue. So what are the battles in this particular area? There are problems with the gold route. It's not always as easy as it might seem. So it can be very expensive. So the quotes you get publishing with a publisher through the gold route can range up to $5,000 per article, which makes it kind of really restrictive. Unless you've got that money through funding, it's very difficult to get it. Often they'll have waivers, so like early career researchers, people from developing countries can publish free, but it does mean it makes it much more difficult to publish if you've got to pay to publish that work. There are sometimes issues around whether there's really any incentive in the publisher then to innovate and to adopt the stuff because they're getting just as much money coming through this route, if not more. And there are arguments that this is actually a much more expensive way to operate. Some publishers have adopted what they call the hybrid route, so you're still paying your subscription charges through your library, but some articles in that journal are open access, so they're getting double dip money, so they're going to get paid twice for it. That seems like a really not a very good bargain at all. And there's also quite a lot of predatory open access practice, so you'll see a lot of these kind of fake journals spring up. There's one, I kind of get sent these emails sometimes, come and publish in our open access journal, and you look at the publisher's website, and they've got like 4,000 journals. You think they can't possibly run those kind of on a good quality, and really they're just trying to get money. So you go to them, a colleague of mine, although they will suck it in, if you like, they were asked to produce a special issue, being edited for a special issue. The next thing you know, they've been asked to sort of pay £1,500 to publish an article, and to get all their friends to pay to publish there. So it's really just kind of they pay to publish model. I think this highlights an issue that Michael Sandel raised in a book called What Money Can't Buy. And he's talking about how the application of market principles in lots of areas just isn't appropriate. He's got a really nice example of a nursery in Israel, I think it was. And they used to have, so it closed at 5, and people would be late picking their children up from the nursery, and the staff were getting really fed up with this. So they introduced a fee for that. So for the first 10 minutes it was so much, for the next 10 minutes it was another fee. And actually what they found was the amount of late pickups increased, because suddenly it was something that people could pay for, whereas beforehand they were kind of felt socially obliged to try and turn up on time, and suddenly it was something they could buy. And I think so once you introduce money into a relationship, it changes the nature of that relationship. And it's difficult not to think that that won't happen with publishing if we are paying to publish. So I run a journal, for instance, an open access journal, and we don't charge people to publish. But if I was getting $3,000 per article, I can't promise that I wouldn't be tempted to publish just another article. That's another $3,000 coming. So it changes the nature of that relationship. Open educational resources, OERs, so it's an area I work in quite a lot. So started in 2001, 2002 with the Hewlett grant at MIT for Open Courseware project. Lots of other people followed suit then. So at the Open University we have this Open Learn project. We've released sort of over 10,000 hours of free educational material. So openly licensed, freely available educational material. So it's been a big success in many ways. There are kind of major projects in most countries, and it's often seen to come a way to help a lot of countries to bring stuff up. Open textbooks, particularly in the US, we've been working with people like OpenStax in my project. It's been a really kind of big success story. I think partly the point of open textbooks is they're quite a simple sell. People understand the point of them. So there's been some research and they reckon about a quarter of the cost of a US degree is spent on expensive textbooks. So what a lot of open textbook movements do is they either pay people to write material and then release it under an open access license, so that the online copy is free, or people would just come together and contribute and have a kind of a book writing sprint over a certain period. Then the good thing about that is it allows the educator then to take that textbook and adapt it. So we've all had this experience where you find a textbook that's kind of good, but chapter 2 is a bit rubbish, chapter 3 is good, chapter 4 is okay. You know, you can change that chapter 2 and perhaps take a chapter 2 from elsewhere and make a textbook that's suited much more to your needs. But the really good thing about open textbooks is I think they're kind of a Trojan horse in many ways. I think a lot of open educational resources are quite a hard sell to people with the kind of online resources that you might want to take and adapt and use, but everyone understands what a textbook is. I can have a free textbook, I can adapt, that's quite an easy sell. So I think they're a good way into open education. And there have been a lot of research on sort of proper savings that students have made for these. So I run a project called the OER Research Hub. We've run lots of surveys with different people. So an interesting find that we found, particularly from SADA, who do lots of material, is it might not necessarily increase performance use of OERs, but it seems to increase students' enthusiasm and all those things that kind of go around studies. So 59% of students said they had increased enthusiasm for study, increased interest in the subject, and felt they'd gained confidence. Now, that might be a kind of, not necessarily to do with the quality of material, it might be because they're having access to the material earlier. So they kind of, whereas beforehand, students often wait until 3 or 4 weeks into a course to think, should I go out and buy that $100 textbook? I'm going to see if the academic really uses it or if it's worthwhile. Whereas now they're all having access to it right at the start of the course. So it could be those kind of things. Community College OER project, they identified reduced costs as kind of a help, I think, that kind of help them keep students, particularly students who can't afford to buy textbooks to start with. They never get those textbooks. They kind of feel like they're always catching up with people who've gone out and bought the textbooks. I think a really interesting finding, which is perhaps underreported, is we find a lot of students are now studying, looking at OERs and studying them before they decide what they're going to study in formal education. So, I mean, in the US you've had a fee system for a long time, but in the UK we've just introduced quite expensive student fees. So the idea, like when I went to university, you could go and sort of try out a course for a year. Actually, I don't want to do biology, I'm going to go and do psychology. You can't do that if you're paying sort of £9,000 a year fees. So what students are doing is that they're looking at a subject saying, do I want to study psychology? I think I do, then I'll go in and study. And actually, once they're also find that about the same sort of percentage of students, once they're in study, are using OERs from elsewhere to supplement their study. So I don't really understand what this lecturer is saying, but I found a really good iTunes University lecture. So I think a really interesting project to do there to follow on would be to see whether those students who are using OER to either study beforehand or while they're in course, whether that affects retention rates, whether it helps keep people in study. So this survey here, this research here, they found that it had gone from 47% of students having purchasing paper textbooks to 93% having the free textbook. And OpenStax, people we've worked with, had over 120,000 downloads of this file now, so at least kind of $3 million savings. So kind of a real tangible stuff that you can say openness is working. So I think so we've got over 12 years of experience now with open educational resources, which in educational technology terms, that's a long-term project. That's kind of an idea that survived. So it's quite a success story in many ways. So this is a map we ran in my project, the OER Research Hub, sort of plotting evidence for and against lots of things. We've got 11 hypotheses. So I think in many ways, when these movements start up, people tend to be very advocacy, kind of enthusiastic, evangelistic about it. I think that's what's needed to kind of get stuff off the ground. You sort of say, I believe OERs will do this kind of stuff. I think we've reached a level of maturity now where we can start looking for that evidence. And inevitably, it's a much more nuanced picture than OERs are good and closed stuff is bad. So what are the battles in this area? You could argue, given the amount of money that's been spent on all these projects, that an awful lot of projects have started up and then closed down. There's an issue around sustainability, but some keep going. So our Open Learn project, for example, was funded by an initial grant from the Hewlett Foundation, which lasted 2 years, that was 2006. And it's now just part of normal practice for us. So for every new course we produce, 5 to 10% is made available on OpenLearn, and they've been tracking the kind of use there, and they reckon they get enough people who come to look at stuff on OpenLearn and then transfer into becoming formal students. That's a worthwhile expense, if you like, so it's kind of self-sustaining. But I think you could argue, has there been enough impact? A lot of money's been spent on these projects, and you couldn't say it's necessarily revolutionised education. But I think, I'm not sure I believe in revolutions in education. So there's a kind of, I think this goes to the point that George was saying, there's also a slight feeling that OERs are a bit like the witch and Hansel and Gretel's done, trying to lure people in. So from commercial providers, particularly publishers, like, here's our nice free stuff, come in, here's the free candy, and now, well, you're hooked into our system. It's now you have to kind of sign a subscription model and those kind of things. And the other thing that's really interesting is like whether they've been overtaken by MOOCs. You know, those of us in the OER world have been like plugging away for years, going, OERs are great, aren't they great? It's free educational stuff, and then suddenly MOOCs came along from nowhere. I blame George, and suddenly they're all in the media. People are getting ringing up. So I know people who like have been. They couldn't get an appointment with their kind of their vice chancellor or senior principal, or whatever, and suddenly MOOCs come along and go, you're the person who knows about open education. What's all this about MOOCs? I've been going on about this for years. So, which leads me nicely on to talk about MOOCs, the next area. So, everyone knows what MOOCs are, massive open online courses. So, kind of these big free open courses came out of somewhere in Canada initially, and then taken up by people like Sebastian Thrun at Stanford. So, if in doubt, do a Google Trends chart. That's kind of a good motto in life. So this kind of just makes that point about how MOOCs have overtaken OER. So the blue line is OERs on Google Trends since 2007. So going along quite nicely, and then from nowhere, 2012, the so-called year of the MOOC, bam, the red line is MOOCs. And so we come up and gather that attention. So you think, wow, MOOCs have come from nowhere. Another good trick to do with Google Trends is, someone recommended this, if you think your subject's really interesting, compare it against Kim Kardashian. So that's what people are really talking about. And you see MOOCs don't even register there. So it's a normalised graph, so let's not get too carried away that MOOCs are that important. They're nowhere near as important as Kim Kardashian, apparently. So the success story in MOOCs is that from nowhere we suddenly got all these major MOOC providers. So at the Open University we set up a company called FutureLearn, to deliver MOOCs mainly in Europe and the UK. In the States there's Coursera, Udacity, edX, there's Iversity in Germany, and OpenEd in Open to Study in Australia. So these big companies we set up, great platforms, delivering lots of content from nowhere. And it does feel like, wow, we've been struggling to do this kind of stuff for ages. If these have been kind of university projects that were taking years and years to get off the ground, from nowhere they kind of suddenly arrive. And the big numbers that are always rolled out from MOOCs are how many millions of students they're going to get enrolled. So I forget what Coursera's numbers are, there's 17 million or something. And there's also the big question that most of those people don't finish a MOOC. We can talk about completion rates, that is an issue. But certainly in terms of if you're trying to get people interested in open education, there's millions of people signing up for open courses. And they've had major media coverage. So in the UK, they've been on our major news channels, they've been cropping up in all the newspapers. I think they're in the New York Times, all those kind of things. The sort of coverage that we would have killed for in open education years ago. And suddenly they're there. So some guy called George Siemens said, if education was grunge, then the MOOCs were its demand. The kind of the breakthrough act for open education. Do you regret that?
I have many regrets.
But I'm not sure you can necessarily say education was like a grunge movement, but I know what George means. It's kind of suddenly people were talking about this thing. So what are the battles in MOOCs? I think there are lots of issues around MOOCs, so I'm not really going to talk about pedagogy or completion rates, those kind of things. I think those are kind of bigger issues. My focus is more on just the issues around openness. Things that are not really open, so in the sense that those of us who work in open educational resources are open, textbooks, think of it, so they're not openly licensed, so I couldn't take a bit of a Coursera MOOC and use it in my own course, that's owned by Coursera. And actually the licenses that people sign with a lot of MOOC companies are often really restrictive, so even as the course provider you can't take your own content and use it elsewhere, because it now belongs to MOOC company X. So a lot of those kind of benefits we think comes from being able to reuse material aren't there with MOOCs, but they're open in terms of they're free to sign up and anyone can go and do them. They're not open in terms of rights and access.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In the data analytics learning MOOC, you're supplementing it with social media, YouTube, Hangouts. Do you own those? I mean, I get confused. Who owns those recordings and whatnot? And
Well,
you
yeah.
have a visual syllabus, which is really cool. Like, do you own that?
Right. Like find out.
Well, it depends who you're with. Who are you with in that MOOC? So, are you with Coursera or edX?
It's edX, so the content is ours.
Yeah.
Student contributions technically sits in edX, because ultimately ownership is defined. There's legal ownership, but there's access ownership. That sort of complicates things a little bit. But right now, that's why we want students to log on their own spaces so that they actually own their content. But it's, anyway, you know what it's like. It's not a smooth process.
Which brings me on to this next point. The idea that there's a kind of centralised data. It's like the Death Star. Everyone, all this, and it makes sense for the MOOC companies. So that's kind of the MOOC providers. That's where their business model may lie. They're not entirely sure what the business model is, I think. But that idea of they own the data, and it's also somewhat difficult for you to get access to that data. They also own the platform. I think there's an interesting point there about whether we surrender a certain element of innovation by letting them own the platform. So the idea, and we've seen this with the LMS, I think. So the idea wasn't that you're creating an e-learning course, you're creating a course to put into your institutional version of Blackboard or whatever. And I think what happens is the idea of a MOOC becomes the Coursera version of a MOOC, or the edX version of a MOOC, rather than you doing what you want to do. So you kind of surrender, you outsource some of that innovation. But having said that, I mean, there's not necessarily bad things. Sometimes it allows people to kind of very easily get online and do stuff. There is issues around the support model. So I work at the Open University, and we've known for years it's kind of those nervous learners, those learners you kind of really want to reach. They need an awful lot of support, and often you'll still lose them. So those kind of early courses, those level 1 courses, we have all the students have about a 15-to-1 ratio with a tutor who will ring them up and speak to them and try to make sure that they're staying online, they've got any issues. Of course, you don't have any of that in a MOOC. You kind of come on and you're on your own. So most of the research so far demonstrates that the demographics are, or people who complete MOOCs are experienced learners, people with postgraduate qualifications. This idea that they're kind of suddenly reaching out and opening up education to everyone may not be true. I mean, maybe that's just an early adopter thing. Maybe in 5 years' time, everyone will be doing MOOCs and completing them. But there is a kind of an issue around whether they're suitable for all types of learners. And there's I have a slight concern there that if you're a nervous learner, you're not sure whether learning is for you. If you come in and you fail at a MOOC, that kind of just reaffirms that belief that learning isn't really for you. So it can almost be harmful. There's also an idea that I think they're kind of hijacking what openness means. If you say to someone what's open education now, a lot of people go, oh, MOOCs. And that's the kind of what openness means. It means free and online. So I think a really good analogy is, has anyone ever been to a safari park, driven through in a car, and you kind of had the cute monkeys or baboons jump in your car and think, those guys are really cute, they're friendly, I like it. And then they start ripping off your area and putting it on. That's kind of MOOCs. That's how it is. And so I think that leads into the next point, which is this idea around narrative, really. So MOOCs have kind of appealed to media in a way that nothing else has in open education. I think it's interesting to think about why that's the case. So what was it about MOOCs that the broadcast media really liked? I think it was because they appealed to what you can call the Silicon Valley narrative, which is it's a very technological solution. It's usually done by outsiders. They don't like people with inside education doing it. And it's a revolution. It's kind of coming to change things in a big kind of sweeping way. That's what they love in kind of Silicon Valley. So something you often see quoted is education is broken. So this is the kind of starting point. So if education is broken, you therefore need a revolution. You therefore need to fix it. It's often stated as fact, if you like. It's right there alongside the boiling point of water. Education is broken. So this guy here, who runs an EdTech startup, surprise. So the education space is massive, very broken. So in the UK, there was a report by some people who work for Pearson's. Right at the start of their report, they say, the models of higher education that march triumphantly across the globe in the second half of the 20th century are broken. there was a company called Degree.com, and they had a slogan, a campaign, which is education is broken, someone should do something. Of course, that's someone being them. Sebastian Thrun, the guy who ran the first kind of big MOOC to grab all the headlines, this quote is gold. It's the Silicon Valley narrative in one quote. Education is broken, face it, it's broken at so many ends, it requires a little bit of Silicon Valley magic to fix it. Even Clay Shirky is often quite insightful and stuff that the education space is massive, very broken. But people rarely say what it is that's broken about education. It's just like it's stated as fact, and therefore we need to fix it. And this is where the language is really important. If you state something as a crisis, then you need people from outside to come in and fix that crisis. But if you state it in terms of opportunity, not that education is broken, but education is a really interesting, exciting time where we can change things, and that's often, that would imply that people from inside the system can do that change. So language is important. Silicon Valley people also have a real kind of obsession with disruption. So Clayton Christensen's idea of disruption, which wasn't a bad idea, but it's kind of one of those terms that's become used for everything now. It's not worth doing anything unless you're disrupting something. So the idea about disruption is that it comes on a completely sweeps away the market. So a good example of disruption is a digital camera. That kind of completely disrupted the existing camera market. But at the moment, everything is open for disruption. So Christensen himself has said disruption is a necessary and overdue chapter in our public schools. So this person dismissed the open education resources because they haven't disrupted higher education, because only disruption counts. And that Avalanche report I mentioned kind of justified itself by saying that universities are now ripe for disruption. And so you get this kind of irresistible, perfect storm for the media around MOOCs. So education is broken, so we've got to do something about it. Education is ripe for disruption, but those things are kind of stated as we all agree with those. And MOOCs are a technological solution to this broken education system. And it's people from outside, so people like Selman Khan often kind of supposes that people can come in and save, riding on the white horse and save education. And I think, the point of being slightly sarcastic here, is not to say that there aren't problems in education. I think that's also part of the problem. It forces you into two camps, of either being a denier, who deny there's any problems with education, or you're kind of let's go completely for revolution and sweep everything away. And I think actually it's somewhere, as usual, it's somewhere in the middle of those two. But I know there are lots of problems with education. So I think what comes out of that is that if you don't engage with this kind of area, these kind of things, someone else will tell your story for you. And that they will write the narrative, which then becomes very difficult to change. Thank you, Tom. That's good. So I think, for instance, there was a survey done last year with the Open Course Library, a big open textbook project. And it's a very strange survey because it was run by the bookstores in US campuses, and lots of people who get an open textbook wouldn't go via their bookstore anyway. And you might wonder whether bookstores are slightly biased, but apparently not. And they found that there was very little use of open textbooks, down to 7%, I think, of these open textbooks. So it's kind of a bit of a failed project. And it becomes very difficult to kind of change that narrative bit, whereas the story of MOOCs is one of success and kind of changing, revolution. So we have to kind of learn how to tell our story around these things. So, in conclusion, the picture I want to make is that openness is not just a kind of peripheral interest now. It used to be kind of a few of us, mainly Canadians, kind of wandering around, banging on about open education, and you could be polite to them and ignore them, and that's fine. But I think it impacts upon an awful lot of higher education practice now, whether it's teaching, research, whether you're publishing works, whether you're using open educational resources, how students are coming to you and what they're studying when they're with you. So I think what we're really facing now is kind of a battle for ownership around all these issues. And I think to go back to the learning management system, that's a kind of a really good story from the past, recent past. In some ways we kind of outsourced the ownership of our own learning environments to other companies who then can sell it back to us and tell us what that direction was. I think we lost a lot of innovation, so there are a lot of really good educational technologists who beforehand might have been innovative and trying different things out on the web, suddenly became the person whose job it was to run the VLE or to put courses into the VLE. So VLE is the UK term for LMS. And so we kind of lost ownership of that, of e-learning, of how we wanted to direct that. I think that we're in a similar position now with open education. It's going to have a really important role in deciding where higher education goes, and we should be part of that decision. So that's my pitch. So the book will be out soon. The kind of general argument is in the article there, the blog there, publishers there. That's the research hub, the project I lead. You saw some of those maps I put up, the kind of OER policy maps and OER research maps. You can go and explore them. And that's that. Thank you, George.
Great. Thanks very much. So we do have about 15 minutes or so for questions. So does any comments or reactions to the presentation? Or was it so brilliantly explained? Go ahead, Peggy.
Okay, this is great. So I teach teachers, and I'm really interested in lowering costs for my students for many reasons. And I actually have two comments, and I think they're kind of related, and they go to the definition of what is included beyond textbooks, like the printed word. So I'm wondering about your comment where you showed the research about usefulness and things, but that was limited to print media. So does open include multimedia?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, so in terms of OERs, I think the open textbook definition of that is a very kind of, that's quite a US-centric interpretation. In the UK and Europe, if you talk about open educational resources, usually people think of online resources, so videos, the things that you might put into an e-learning course rather than open textbooks. But I think open textbooks are just a good example. I have this theory that, I haven't really proven it, but it's like openness is like a virus. If you kind of get people to catch it, then they start wanting to look for it elsewhere. So, and I think this is probably not a good analogy to use when people are scared about Ebola, but let's roll with it. So, so I think open textbooks are kind of a good exposure to the open virus, if you like, because people understand what a textbook is and they know how to change a textbook. But once they've done it, then they start thinking, actually, why can't I do that? Why can't I use these resources? Why can't I do all these things? So I think they're a good entry level thing. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it'd be great if the whole discourse beyond this roof included more talk about multimedia, because it's so much more engaging.
That's absolutely. I think so. We've been working with the Flipped Learning Network, for instance, and they use a lot of video. And an interesting finding we found from our surveys was that often in the OER world, people say that it's really hard to find reuse. People don't tend to reuse OERs much. And we asked people whether they adapted online resources, and we had about 79% of people said they did, like educators. But I think what they mean by adaptation varies. So for some people, it just means I looked at it, and then I adapted the ideas from it for my own teaching. For other people, it means I took that video and I put it in a different context. And for other people, it might mean they kind of completely change the video or multimedia. They kind of use their own version and mix it. So there's a kind of a real continuum of what adaptation means. I think you're absolutely right. I think actually the multimedia is kind of you get the real payoff.
And then I had another thought about the reason OERs haven't disrupted, if that's true, is maybe due to quality. And again, that might go back to the lack of visuals or multimedia. Some of these OERs, like I don't want to read a book without pictures.
Yeah.
And I know my students don't.
Well, I mean, in terms of quality,
That's one aspect.
they've done the research that's come out has found that they're as good, if not better, than the things they're kind of replacing. So I don't necessarily think it's about. I think perhaps disruption is the wrong goal to have. You don't want it to be disruptive. It's actually education is a big, complex system, and so these things take time. So we've had over a decade, and actually that's what you need to start to get traction. It's not going to be. I think people often. That's slightly what worries me about the whole MOOC thing, and particularly with venture capitalist kind of funding. Because venture capitalists often want a quick return. They wouldn't wait over 10 years for you to start to have an impact. So I think that's. So I'm not sure disruption should always be the goal, but perhaps impact.
I'd like to hear what you have to say about how you see open access journals as being perceived in academia. Do you think there's a difference, even not only between open access and traditional, but between different types of open access where you have to pay or where you don't have to pay? And how are these things being seen like, you know, in the, it's not the RE anymore, it's the REF.
Yeah.
Does it have the same status?
Well, the point of the ref was that they wouldn't differentiate by journals. They weren't looking at journal impact factor. It was about the impact of the articles. In some ways, it should make sense. It should make a difference where you publish it. I think that really differs across disciplines, though. It's a really good point. So, I think in education technology, in my area, there are quite a few good open access journals, and people are quite happy to publish there. And in other disciplines, there aren't any good ones admitted. Often the advice to people they want to get tenure is you've got to publish in these journals, and that's the most important thing. So it does vary a lot across disciplines. And I was having this discussion with my research team the other week about. I've got a strict open access only policy that we will only publish in open access. We're writing about OERs, and it's one of my pet hates. You know, when someone will say, "Here's a really good research article on the impact of open educational resources. Now pay $40 to access this article." That's not right. But you could argue, well, perhaps if you want to reach different audiences, perhaps you need to publish in those journals that and they're not reading these open access journals. I mean, I think now that most publishers are allowing a lot of the main journals to go open access, some of that are disciplined, but there is a suspicion, particularly around those predatory open access journals, whether it's just kind of they'll accept anything as long as you pay them $1,000.
You say that you ran an open access
Yeah.
journal, but you don't have to pay.
No, yeah. So I run a journal called JIME at the Open University, and I think that's an interesting model actually, because universities used to run university presses, and they kind of outsource that. But I think we run it using an open source software at the back called OJS. So really, it's just our time and a bit of technical expertise to run the server that's required. And I think you can see more universities doing that. Perhaps there are lots of ways, I think, to rethink the publishing model. Instead of we give lots of money to the libraries to pay big subscription fees to the publishers. Some of that money could go to running your own open access journals.
So is it financed then by the university?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So my time and we had some staff time.
I should mention, if you don't mind me jumping in, so there's one of the top journals in educational technology, the Introductory Review of Open and Distance Learning, out of Athabasca. That's the same thing. It's university supported. There's no fee to publish. It's, I think, in terms of ranking in the ed tech journal space, they're probably top 5-ish or so, I believe. So they're quite well regarded. The Journal for Learning Analytics that we use for the Society for Learning Analytics Research, that's also a fully open journal, no cost to submit. So there's different ways, whether it's a university that takes this on as their commitment to a field, or whether it's a professional society that does this as well. So there are a range of options that don't involve that monetary transactions.
And I think we'll see more of those. So I think I've tried to pitch for a kind of core team, so one technical person, maybe one support admin person. You could probably run 4 journals of that kind of core team. So that might be the sort of commitment that a university can make. We're going to run 4 open access journals, free to publish, and we'll cover those costs out this month.
Other questions, comments? Laura.
Do you think the whole starting out ownership can be one of the players in limiting the impact of OER? Is that sorting out that whole who owns what kind of thing?
Do you mean who owns the license to OERs, or who owns the...
Who owns the intellectual property, that
Yeah.
kind of thing?
That does get murky when you're working for a university, whether it belongs to the university or the individual. I think with a lot of this stuff, it depends what you want to get out of it. My last book and this book have been published open access, and I think academics usually vastly overestimate the commercial worth of their content. They think someone could steal my fantastic idea and make millions. Like, unless you're kind of doing medical research, that's probably not the case. So what you really want is for more people to use it and read it and share it, and that kind of brings its own reputation with work. Right? So I think it's less of an issue than as long as you've got a decent license on it, so people need to attribute you if they're going to use it. I think those issues are quite easily resolved. Most material you want to use, it's not going to do you out of a job by other people taking your content and using it in their teaching. Anyway, it enhances your reputation. But I do think we've got systems in place. This goes back to my last book. We've got systems in place that recognise sharing for research. We've got systems in place that recognise sharing for teaching materials. So if I could go along to my promotion panel and say, this article has had 5,000 citations, that'd be fantastic. If I went on with that, so this OER has had 5,000 downloads and uses in teaching. Okay, so that doesn't match across. I mean, enhancing the reputation of teaching is important.
Well, another aspect that I think is a bit, go right after that, but one aspect I think is a little challenging is the value layers that publishers are adding that I'm not seeing come out of the open education resource
That's
space
right.
yet.
Yeah.
So a few of those value layers are just quality of instructional resources for the educator. Another aspect is some level of analytics and feedback that allows them to see what's being used and how much. So what has to happen for OER enthusiasts and the OER movement as a whole to start to compete with that level of integrated value offerings that the publishers are providing?
That's a good point. And so you see that particularly with open access journals. So the journal I run is actually run kind of on the periphery of everyone's time. It's like in my work plan, there are 0 days allocated to running that journal, running a bit of a shoestring. And so I just can't compete with the kind of slick operation of a commercial publisher. So actually what we're doing now is the people who are publishing that book, Ubiquity, also publish journals online. But they're a non-profit organisation, so they've got quite low article charges. They can charge £300, £400 per article. So we're going to shift our journal over to them, so they host our journal, but the university will cover the charges for authors that come along and pay. So it's still free to publish, we've just got a line we will pay for it. And that allows them, so they'll do a lot of that kind of nice analytics, feed data back. So I think we need more of those kind of solutions. I think particularly with OERs, what we've been working on over the past few years is building the community of people who are OER aware, if you like. It's almost like the primary audience, people who know what OERs are, can become advocates for it. And actually, if you want to push through and kind of really get mainstream adoption, you kind of need to push through to people who don't care what an OER is. They just want a useful tool, a useful resource. So when we did our surveys, we asked people where they go. It's YouTube, Khan Academy, TED Talk, that's about it. We listed all these OER repositories and no one's going. So I think it's a real, to your point, George, it's a real issue about trying to increase the kind of the global brand of OERs. It's like, so they're up on your list of things to search for. So once we point them out to them, these are great resources. I didn't know Joran was there, I didn't know Merlot was there. Once we kind of send people there, they really like it. But kind of teachers are pushed for time, they'll go to YouTube, Khan Academy, and that's it.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I was really curious about the Open University and that whole concept. How does that affect retention rates and graduation rates? If you're letting, if there's no bar for people to get into the university, then how does that affect how many people finish and maybe the quality of students at the end?
It affects the people who finish, certainly. So we've also got a very modular system, so people can take a course, drop out for a bit, come back, study with. So it's very difficult to know who's. It's not like it's a definite 3-year degree. They can take 6 years, 8 years, whatever it takes to finish a degree. So it's hard to know exactly when people are in or out of the university. But certainly, so there is a price to pay. So I ran a big level 1 course, the kind of first big e-learning course at the OU. So level 1 is the entry-level course that people who've never studied before were studying. And our retention rate in that course was about 47%. So it's a 32-week course. But when you compare that against MOOCs, it's about 10% retention rate, it's great. But still, against most universities, there'd be a kind of an alarm going off if you were getting those kind of retention rates. But that's kind of the price you pay for not filtering on the way in, if you like. So you get that. But we put in place lots of support for those people and try and get them. But some people will come in and say, it's just not for me studying. I thought it would be. So you do pay a price for retention, for being open. That's our reason detriment. In terms of quality, though, OU graduates are kind of really well respected throughout certainly the UK. And actually, I think employers often really like them. You've got to be quite determined to kind of finish an open university degree, and open university materials are kind of very well respected. So a lot of that initial, back in the 70s when we were starting up, a lot of that initial fight they had to do was kind of to get that brand of distance learning recognised as a quality thing. Because often before it'd be considered to be kind of correspondence tuition, which was kind of always a bit low grade. So I think in the US, distance education for a long time had quite a poor reputation. It was kind of like a second rate education, but there wasn't an equivalent of the Open University here. That's changed.
Okay. No other questions? Well, thanks very much, Martin. Appreciate that informative overview. Thank you.